All right. We are back for another exciting week of GPS Live. Welcome to everybody tuning in live online. And if you are watching this recorded in the future, we really appreciate you too. This is going to be a very exciting week. Apparently, a lot of things happened that we're going to be discussing. On top of that, we love hearing your comments, so please feel free to interact with us during the show. We hear you. We will include you. Give us some feedback. Tell us how we're doing, and even some great stuff that you're seeing in the cybersecurity community. But with that, Ian, welcome back to the show.
Well, hello. I'm glad to be back after a wonderful GPS Sec in Atlanta. I hope you got to see some of you out there.
Yeah, absolutely. If you attended our GPS Sec in Atlanta or any of the GPS Sec events around the country, we'd love to see you, love to hear. Come visit us in person and get the opportunity to shake hands, give hugs, or ask some great questions. But Ian, you actually spoke about some really cool stuff, didn't you?
Yeah, no, we did. We got to go on stage, Trace Hollifield and I, and do a deep fake of the founder and managing partner of GuidePoint, Michael Volk, live, and talk about protecting people against social engineering attacks. So definitely come out to these events. They're really great. We do some technical, we do some policy, we got vendors, and at this last one, we even got pictures with the World Series trophy, which was crazy.
Yeah, that was super cool. Well, both you and I were up there in Atlanta. We had a wonderful time. The weather was actually kind of hot, but super fun. But outside of that, sounds like huge success in your talk. I heard a lot of great things. So thank you for your contributions to the cybersecurity community.
Indeed, and yours as well, sir. It was good to see you in Atlanta, not just virtually.
Yeah. Well, for everybody keeping track, this is GPS Live for the week of June 28th, 2024. Now, before we get into our stories, we always do have a bit of a formality here. We have to remind everybody that we are just a couple of talking heads. In fact, the views and opinions expressed by the hosts of the live stream are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official opinions of GuidePoint Security. There are definitely times where we are known to potentially call out a business by name, and we do not endorse nor want to discredit any of these companies. It is just we find that it's relevant to the story, especially if you are reading these articles at home too. It's not like you won't figure out what's going on just as much.
Yeah, security's hard. Stuff happens. We're here to talk about it.
Absolutely. So to kind of kick things off here, we have a number of stories, but we'll jump right into kind of this bit of espionage going on in our first story here, coming to us from a couple of different sources between TechCrunch and Bleeping Computer. I would say everybody's favorite remote desktop tool. Not saying a rat, but one that's more commercially available and oftentimes free. Is being targeted by spies, and their corporate network has been hacked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So TeamViewer, unfortunately, friend to many, no matter what side of the keyboard aisle you run on, whether it be gray, black, or otherwise. TeamViewer compromised or access granted to, what was it, 600,000 individual organizations. And John, you said the numbers we were chatting before, but the number of devices, it was with a big B. What was it?
Yeah. So they claim to have 600,000 global paying customers with 2.5 billion devices attached to the TeamViewer network. And keep in mind here, we're talking about that the cyber attack has happened, and TeamViewer is saying that it has been contained. This is just one of those things where when you're this size of a business and you have some kind of global impact, you're going to be targeted by some of the largest nation state threat actors. In this case, APT29. And what was their other name?
Oh, well, then there's my favorite name, but they're under here. I'm going to say it in my best announcer voice. Midnight Blizzard.
Yeah, Midnight Blizzard. And for those also keeping track of your APTs at home, we're no stranger to them, right? You mentioned they have a bit of a history.
Yeah, they are also the fanciest of bears and go by Fancy Bear, APT29 Nobelium, and were during the investigation for the SolarWinds breach, this is becoming their modus operandi, is getting into tools like SolarWinds and like TeamViewer that already have the access. So, why go through and compromise one company when you can compromise 600,000 companies by attacking a single source. So yeah, this seems to be what they're doing, whether it be SolarWinds, TeamViewer, and whatnot. They find the weak links and use that to pivot in.
Yeah, there's an entire industry out there known as remote monitoring and management, or RMM for you IT team fellows. And this is quickly becoming a supply chain attack story where if you already have your arms deep within organizations, we saw this, right? Again, with SolarWinds, we saw this with MoveIt, we see this with a lot of places. If it already exists on this massive scale, well, then let's go after that company that has this massive scale proliferation. And so it as far as the details of the actual compromise, not a whole lot is public at this time, but it is public knowledge that the event did take place, and that there is a thorough investigation happening, and that they're working on determining the breadth of what's happening. But this just kind of is, it seems like a theme, and we're actually going to talk about this a little bit throughout the show. But supply chain is massive. What is the software that you're using, right? We like to say SBOM, the software bill of materials, but that applies at multiple levels, right? At the operating system level, what's installed? At the application level, what are the modules, right? And it's kind of all over the place. And this is one of those cases where it's an internal tool often used by many folks, good and bad, sadly. And that's, seen as an easier way in rather than going after the ultimate target directly. You may even get the opportunity to have a widespread infiltration. But we talked a little bit before the show because there's kind of a side story we want to talk to our viewers about regarding, tools like TeamViewer, right? And picking on people like the elderly and other things like that.
Oh,
where
yeah.
our community needs to be aware of this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, not trying to pick on TeamViewer too much, but TeamViewer really is often the de facto choice for a lot of these criminal organizations that are going through and targeting, say, the elderly or small businesses, saying, "Oh, we're your help desk, and you've got see all these errors in the Windows event log." Yeah, those are always there, but if you don't know, you don't know, and they'll go through and scam them, saying, "Oh, well, we'll remove the malware, or we'll do whatever for $125," and that's kind of in a best case scenario. And in a worst case scenario, they're using it to gain persistence, move across networks, or create entire new botnets by doing these types of scams, getting people on the phone and getting into multiple networks. So if you are a TeamViewer user, if you are someone who uses it in a professional capacity, you're definitely going to want to go to the TeamViewer websites and find out what they have from their statements on what you should do. But always, always, always a good thing to do is rotate passwords, change credentials, shut down those services until you know that they can be trustworthy again, and use maybe an alternate method of management.
Yeah, and again, this isn't any particular brand. This happens to a lot of different
Yeah.
companies, and it's again, like I mentioned, due to the prevalence across the globe in a technical aspect. APT 29 sees it as a tasty target, and they've seen this with other large targets before. So there's oftentimes these kind of situations where it is a third party application and the risk is going to always exist and be inherent, and you have to be prepared for when one of your tools becomes more of a problem than a solution.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. What do you do? What? While you were talking, I was thinking, how there's lull bins, right? There's living
Yeah,
off the land
yeah,
binaries that you can use. I'm like, is this a living off the cloud attack? Like,
totally.
right?
It's focusing on potentially, again, as we determine whether or not remote access to individual companies are involved, like we saw with SolarWinds. We'll learn more, but yeah, utilizing things that already exist that seem inert.
Living off the SaaS
Living
attack
off the
or
SaaS
something.
cloud.
Yeah, right.
But talking about the cloud, that does help kind of pivot us and segue into our next story, which is when telcos attack. This is absolutely crazy, because I'm as a consumer, right? We all have home internet. As a business, we all have business internet, and you can imagine there's supposed to be this really important hop in the chain to allow you to access all of the things that you need on the internet. But what happens when they decide to play nasty? And that's what's happening here from a South Korean telco infecting their customers with malware, right?
Right. Yeah, no, this is bonkers. And before we even go into this story, if you're in the sound of John and I's voice, and you don't understand the capabilities that ISPs have to shape your traffic, and they do it for specific reasons, for performance and making sure that you have a good experience. But they can do so much, and the South Korean telecom company did exactly that. They were irritated, if you will, about users, actual paying customers using peer-to-peer torrent type services, and deployed malware essentially through a service. And this comes from Tom's Hardware, the article here reporting this, but it comes from a service called WebHard's Grid. And I know that sounds weird, but it stands for Web Hard Drive. And basically, people going to that site, they were injecting these tools in there that, for some users, started causing problems years ago, even bricking their computers, all in an effort to stop torrenting. So, I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, now we were talking a little bit before the show, and it's not the first time we've seen a business push out something that may seem harmless, but actually becomes dangerous to the end consumer. We saw this a lot in stuff like DRM, for instance, as you mentioned, where the intention is we need to have some kind of application on the end user's computer to control and limit what they're doing to make sure they're within appropriate usage rights. But sadly, in this case, this software was deleting or adding files, directories, and in some cases even causing computers to become unusable and crashing them. And the scale of this also is there's 600,000 torrent users within this network that are reporting problems with their computers. Now, this isn't necessarily against torrents. What's happening is that web hard drive software uses the torrent protocol to communicate between hosts. And this ISP just wasn't pleased with that. And so there were 13 individuals that are being reported here within the organization, some actual employees and some subcontractors that are directly tied to the distribution of this malware. And furthermore, it's being investigated that this broke like laws within the country of South Korea.
Right. Yeah. No, it's there's a lot of consumer protections, and I can't speak. I think none of us really can speak to the finite kind of laws of South Korea, but you're absolutely right. In many countries, this would be considered a major violation, right? They can shape traffic within their rules, but making modifications locally to your computer that causes adverse effect. Again, not a lawyer, not your lawyer, but if I were a lawyer, I'd be putting together a class action lawsuit.
Yeah, we talked about some of the examples of what an ISP can do, or just, for the consideration of our viewers, if there is a system somewhere in line between your source and destination, the data along the way can be decapsulated and modified at the payload. And what we're saying is when you visit a website, it may not necessarily be the original website as intended. It may have additional code, JavaScript, HTML, something added to it by the ISP or any of those multitude of hops along the way. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind. We're not saying this is necessarily how the malware was delivered. In fact, that's still being dug through.
Right.
But the fact that you can ultimately decide what the end content potentially looks like, regardless of the source origin, just goes to show an ISP's level of influence. The other thing is to consider that when you use your ISP for DNS, they're now capable of capturing and logging every website you visit, not necessarily the content on the page, but the .com aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, your ISP provider has the ability to see everything you do. Now, there's ways around that, VPN and things like that. But even still, like John said, DNS, you can encrypt DNS. Well, someone's going to jump in and say DNSSEC. But,
I know, right?
yeah, exactly. But you still have to route it somehow, right? Exactly. So one of the things that fascinates me about the story, to kind of put a bow on it, what John said, is we don't know how they were doing this. And it's very likely that we will never know unless it actually goes to trial. And I don't know what Korea's evidence laws are, but there is precedent for this that we can talk about of how this attack might work. And a few years ago, the People's Republic of China didn't like that there was a GitHub around VPN software that allowed for their filtering to take effect inside of the company for their censorship and things like that. And so what they did, because they control all of that perimeter, is injected additional scripts into every request to that to that GitHub library. And in doing so, every single person in China became a DDoS against that particular URL in GitHub and just knocked it completely offline. So they just said, yeah, every user that goes to a website in China, we're going to add in this query to go look at this thing, even though they never see it. And you get a couple billion devices hammering that thing, and they can do it at the network level.
Yeah, it's really impressive. And we are in an ever-changing environment where encryption is becoming more and more prevalent, stronger. But we also have the opposing side, which is we need to be able to break encryption when necessary for potential threats like terrorism and stuff like that. And so there's always a debate going on, and we're not here to necessarily tell you which side you need to be on,
Right.
but considering that taking encryption apart and then re-encrypting something along its path isn't just fully capable. It is happening in parts of the world. And so just something to keep in mind next time you are surfing the web. But let's kind of slide our way into an interesting one here. Let's just, right. LockBit is no stranger to being, one, a criminal organization, two, a bunch of filthy liars, and three, seem to be doing these Houdini tricks or we've talked about on a show where it comes up and it gets taken down, and then it comes back and it gets taken down. And we're seeing the return of a lot of these. But in this latest one, LockBit has been claiming that they've hacked the feds, at least what we call feds here in the United States, more specifically the U.S. Federal Reserve. But the internet and everybody else involved seems to call not true. Shenanigans. They've hacked a particular bank that just happens to be loosely tied to the Federal Reserve. But like most banks are in some way tied to the Federal Reserve. And also, we talked about this for a show, but the Federal Reserve is not just a thing. It is a distribution of banking networks, right? But LockBit's got a lot to say about this, right?
Yeah, they do. They went through and were saying, we've hacked the Federal Reserve. We have the banking details of some of the largest organizations in the world, and we demand all the monies. And one of their statements that was actually really funny is clearly a negotiator got involved, and they were upset and made it very public that they're like $50,000 for this data, pasha, like that. Or they're like, no. Here's the thing, though. This, just as we mentioned, is going to be a theme, was more of a supply chain attack, not in actual software like was necessarily being deployed by the Korean telecom, but more in the fact that they had a additional provider, or not provider, but a partner. Like John said, there are many banks connect to this, and they were compromised. So really, this LockBit group was only seeing a portion of it, but that's nowhere near as news grabby to force people to pay than saying we got the Fed's data. Well, they did, but how much?
It's not unheard of for ransomware organizations like this one to gain access to a set of files or a bit of data and focus only on the maybe letterhead, regardless of the origin of these things. And that's kind of what's happening in this case, is that there are documents that have the letterhead, the figurative letterhead of the U.S. Federal Reserve, but in reality were acquired through a third-party bank that is connected to the Federal Reserve. Now, that doesn't mean that a hack didn't take place. A hack indeed did take place, and that is an ongoing investigation as it stands. The threat actors are claiming to have 33 terabytes of data, going around here. The other concept
33 terabytes or 6 open Chrome tabs.
Yes, that of your RAM. That's correct.
Right.
But yeah, it's you mentioned a $50,000 thing, which doesn't seem to be that much. So maybe they're starting to realize this isn't as valuable potentially. But the other thing too is that their particular target may have, and like we've seen with the previous stories, been targeted because of what they do. In fact, they oftentimes were involved as a platform for other fintech programs and investments for consumers, whether that was with cryptocurrency or other forms of, we'll say, unconventional banking. Right, it's still FDIC insured at the end of the day, but fintech companies were trying to put a spin on savings and used this particular bank that was compromised as that platform. So again, there's no necessary tie, but it is noted in an article also that came out from Bloomberg regarding the attack. But to focus less on what's going on there and LockBit itself, this is truly whack-a-mole happening in real time. We every week it seems like we're covering some member or orchestrator of LockBit being arrested and put in jail, their services being shut down at scale, and they are very quickly returning, right? And it just goes to show that, like things like Anonymous, LockBit isn't necessarily a person or group of people. It could potentially be a very large set of entities on a global scale, and when one head of the Hydra falls, more are there to take its place.
You know what you just said reminds me of? LockBit is the Dread Pirate Roberts of right? It's like the Dread Pirate Roberts, he dies, he retires, and he gives it to another one, and to another one, and to another one, and the important part is the boogeyman feature of it, right? That everyone's scared of the Dread Pirate Roberts, and this is of course from the classic movie The Princess Bride. But it's never been the same person, so they're almost elevated to legendary status. So yeah.
You can hide behind this moniker, but talking about hiding behind somebody else's identity, this does give us a really good segue into more supply chain issues coming up.
I was going to give you a little golf clap on the
there.
That was nice.
I'm on a roll today. Speaking to us, so an article coming from Bleeping Computer. It's actually two articles, but it focuses on something called polyfill.io. But that's not necessarily the topic of the story. The topic of the story is, what are you including in your web pages, like JavaScript files from third-party sources, and how can you constantly maintain that those third-party sources are hosting the file that you're looking for? And so one of the examples is stuff like Minify. Or CDN optimizations, where you simply just add a line of HTML to your web page, and this JavaScript file is brought in and performs a number of operations. In Polyfill's case, it helps optimize legacy browsers. And now the user has a better, faster experience. But sadly, when you're calling out to these other websites, over time, those websites may get sold or may be hijacked. In this case, it's sold, but then repurposed, right?
Right. Yeah, no, it's really hard to understate the impact of this, and not just from the polyfill aspect, but we have seen attackers start to utilize the overworked, not paid, open source community. This was both in the, XZ components that were, XZ components in Linux, where they're just coming in and saying, hey, let me help you, I'll be a maintainer. And that's just how the open source community works. And there's so much of our infrastructure that relies on these packages that people just kind of do as a side project and maintain collectively. And unfortunately, attackers have realized that they can leverage that burnout in a lot of cases. In this case, it wasn't that. In this case, what they did was they found credentials for a large WAF load balancing company. You can probably guess which one. And they found credentials in a GitHub repository. And, how that happened, don't know. Could have been, a bad practice. Could have been somebody made a mistake. But they found credentials for the API for that. And they were able to pull out tons of additional information and then further modify the polyfill repo so that they could launch attacks off of it, etc. So this is a problem that isn't just polyfill. It's a problem that is, I don't know, for lack of a better term, structural to the software community. So I don't know how to solve it. John, you got ideas?
Well, the biggest concern here is that you, like you said, you have a number of libraries and resources and includes and imports and stuff like that, for every language that rely on outside sources. In this case, JavaScript relies on a request to another hosted file. We've seen this historically where maybe a domain expires on accident, that some bad actor comes in and registers for themselves and hosts something malicious instead. And now everybody who's calling that JavaScript file is also executing their malicious stuff on end users' computers. In this case, also, you can potentially just buy a company and say, okay, well, look, you're being used by hundreds of thousands of websites across the internet. I'm going to buy your company and ultimately continue to host your JavaScript file that helps people, but I'm going to start backdooring it myself and adding additional things, and it'll take a long time for people to know. So there's a number of different techniques that threat actors are using to target individuals who simply rely on the existence of something else on the internet. And sadly, that we're watching this happen in real time. And it is, there isn't really like a way, right? It's you have to, one, inventory all of your dependencies, and then two, this seems like an additional step of monitoring and maintaining the authenticity of those dependencies, right? And some may say it's as simple as, well, then why are you calling out to an outside source? Why don't you download the file and host it yourself? And it's because there's constant revisions, optimizations, and changes that happen over time, and it's not as simple as necessarily always hosting it yourself. The other aspect is, the reality is, it takes up space, and if you are pushing out content, you are being billed for all ingress and egress in most cloud platforms. And by simply sourcing something from somewhere else on the internet, it doesn't really affect your bill as the hosting provider of this content. It affects ultimately somebody else's. And so there are a number of business arguments, I would say, that would validate this kind of usage. But security is clearly showing us otherwise.
Yeah, and there's compliance pieces too, and I think this is a really good way to button up this story. Is this is starting to get paid attention to by the SEC, by the White House in the United States, our executive branch, but even more so, the one that will probably get businesses' attention is PCI. PCI 4.0 has come out, and it has requirements now that not only do you know that your software and modules are running as designed and have not been modified, but that they are delivered to the endpoint. I think it's in section 6. Somebody can in the comments correct me, but I think it's in section 6 where that you can control and detect when something like a script that you're calling has been modified, and that's through hashes or other technical means. But organizations are now saying, if you want to be PCI compliant, payment card industry, to take credit cards, you're going to have to know when these bits of software that you don't necessarily control have changed. And that's because of attacks like this.
Yeah, it is. There isn't necessarily one solution that we would suggest to implement it. It's an entire concept and program around keeping track of this. And this, again, is just an example in the HTML and JavaScript space, right? There's also at your developer level, whether it's Java, Python, Rust, whatever your application is in these days, and they have their own series of concerns. We've talked about stuff like Ruby Gems and Pip being compromised at the particular library level and also pushed out. So it's going to continue to be a challenge. We do have one last story.
I want to rail through the story in about a minute.
I know, we can run right through it, but everybody's favorite. I have a pair of AirPods, and I'm going to go update their firmware right now.
Yeah, so Apple patches AirPods Bluetooth vulnerability that could allow eavesdropping. So really the big takeaway from this story is, if you've got AirPods 2nd generation or later, AirPods Pro all models, AirPods Max, Power Beats Pro, and Beats Fit Pro, you want to go check your patching channels. And John, you brought up exactly why, because it's not just AirPods, it's also Power Beats and Beats Fit.
Yeah, exactly. Apple bought the Beats brand and puts their H1 and H2 chips that are in the AirPods historically also in Beats. So just because you don't have an Apple branded thing doesn't mean it's still not affected. And there was a number of CVEs that are patched recently as part of this. You brought up a really interesting one.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the pre-show was kind of funny, but yeah, there's another CVE around this, and it's being called the first spatial computing attack. And essentially, a researcher was able to use the AR-Kit quick look feature that, and I'm assuming this is if you're using either an iPhone and you're holding it up, or the Vision Pro.
Yeah.
That they can inject an unlimited number of virtual objects into your view, right? So you can consider how that might be used, but let's just say the elephant in the room, and you
It's
have now
literally right
100
over there.
elephants around you, and you can't get rid of them.
Yeah.
So the first spatial computing DDoS attack we've witnessed history.
It's happening in real time, as always. But that does wrap up our week here at GPS Live. Again, this was for the week of June 28th, 2024. If you watch this live, we really appreciate you tuning in. Always, please leave us a comment where you're coming in from. And if you like the show and any other suggestions you have for us, if you're watching it in the future, still leave a comment, because we do come back and read everything you say. I get these little notifications. Ian, it was a pleasure as always having you on the show. I really appreciate it.
Good to be here, man.
With that, I am Jonathan Singer.
I'm Ian Meyer.
And have a good one out there. Enjoy, everybody.